This is the third short video for Module 2 of Global History. This one looks at World War I and its main causes. First, we're going to look at some useful definitions. The word list is empire, arms race, propaganda, war reparations, dates of the world wars. Some of these you saw also in your Module 1 vocabulary handout. First, empire. In empire, one country dominates and exploits other states or countries. There can be economic, political, social, and or cultural exploitation. There can even be genocide, either a wiping out of one group of people at the beginning of empire or a slow structural genocide during empire. Usually the dominant state has a culture or ethnicity different from the dominated regions. A great danger throughout history, as we saw in the last film, is that anyone that's different from a group, different from us, we can scapegoat or dehumanize them or look upon them as evil so that it's acceptable to dominate or kill them. Arms race, which you still hear in the news today, it's a competition between two or more nations to own or build more powerful weapons. War reparations. This is something more from history than today, but that's compensation intended to cover damage or injury during a war. So it may include money or goods or property transfers from territory or colonized lands. For instance, Louisbourg, it would change hands in the 18th and 17th century as Britain won a war. It would take Louisbourg from France as part of the war reparations. France would take Louisbourg back. Sometimes money, but often territory, particularly colonized territory, would be exchanged after a war. And war reparations are usually negotiated or imposed at treaty talks after an armistice or ceasefire. Propaganda. This definition pops up in every module of global history. Do you remember it? This is the one we use in the course. It's a technique of persuasion that uses deceit or half-truths and or appeals to the emotions rather to reason to convince. Very common in war. Can't have war without propaganda, apparently. And from a Canadian perspective, here are the dates of the world wars. World War I, 1914-1918. World War II, 1939-1945. I don't ask you to memorize a lot of dates in this course, but these are some dates that help you sort what happened before and after important parts of 20th century history. And sometimes people mix up World War I and II and think there were Nazis in World War I. Very important to remember there were no Nazis in World War I. So there are our definitions: empire, arms race, propaganda, war reparations, and the dates of the world wars. You'll probably see one or more of those when you write your Module 2 quiz. So World War I, you may be wondering why I'm in a course where I can only cover a couple of topics with you, why we're talking about World War I. Why is it still important? Well, as we saw, World War I resulted from animosity generated in previous conflicts. It's a good lesson in history. But it was the first major war using the Industrial Revolution innovations and technologies. This technology allowed for total war. And World War I caused the conditions that led to World War II. Yes, even the rise of the Nazis in 1930s Germany. So without World War I, we wouldn't have had World War II. The world wars contributed directly or indirectly to most of today's global conflict. The legacy of colonialism and resource depletion accounts for most of the rest, and as you can see, they are tied up with the Industrial Revolution and World War. After the wars, during the wars, the men in power would sit down and redraw the map of the Middle East, redraw the map of Africa. And many of these lines on the map were very arbitrary and really fueled conflicts throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. For Canada and other former colonies of the British Empire, the contribution to the mother country in the war effort in World War I helped establish an independent national identity. This is true. In Canadian history, we tend to really play up that reason and make the war sound like a great thing because it got Canada its independence, true independence from Britain. But really, that was an evolving situation that would have happened, and this reason is often used to justify World War I. And for women, this is another reason that's often built up about the importance of war. Women's contribution to the war effort in factories, in the army, overseas as nurses and ambulance drivers, helped win more political and human rights for women. The women said after the war, hey, you used our labor, we were important, at least let us be people, persons in the law, let us vote. Women couldn't vote before the war in most places, and it took a long time after the war in many places. So that is another reason to remember why World War I is still important. The main causes of World War I, and you notice I've got main all in capitals, so many history books that give a quick overview of World War I, like we're doing in this course, use this acronym of MAIN to remember the causes. And they are militarism, alliances, industrialization, and nationalism. So they're usually considered the four main causes. Militarism is part of nationalism in many countries. Citizens were educated to believe that their country and their ethnic group were superior in military power, strategies, and prowess. And military stuff was good. By God's will, their country was superior. Militarism is a good thing. And some countries today still glorify militarism rather than looking upon military as a necessary evil to help settle some of the world's disputes. Alliances were another main cause of World War I, and these were based on perceived national interest, family loyalties. Remember, those kings and queens intermarried their kids all over Europe, and traditional ethnic and religious rivalries, and plain greed. So, countries all over the world, particularly in Europe before World War I, were lined up in a couple of alliances. Countries that were allied agreed to come to each other's defense if attacked. So when Austria declared war on Serbia due to an assassination, there was a domino effect. All major European countries were drawn into World War I. And then their colonies and their territories and their allies outside of Europe all were drawn into what became a world war. Industrialization, which we talked about in a previous video, fueled World War I. Remember, that's when society is transformed from an agricultural base into one based on the manufacture of goods and services. So the need for raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution and to enrich the merchants and owners of the factories led to conflict over resources, colonies, and trade routes. The innovation of the Industrial Revolution led to an arms race for weapons more deadly than any known previously, and one thing history has shown, arms races tend to lead to war. You stockpile them, you keep thinking the other fellow has more guns and bombs than you, someone's going to start using those guns and bombs. And nationalism. In all major European countries, there was a feeling that each country was superior to the others. And this was cultivated and taught in school. Even in my lifetime, we were sort of, it's one thing having pride in your country, but we were kind of taught when I was a kid, that Canada was kind of superior to other nations. And if you watch the news or even look at Facebook, some nations still do believe that God has singled them out as special. So when you have a belief like that, it's not far to believe that you have the right to take over other territories or use the resources of other countries as your own. Just before World War I, there was a surge of nationalism among the Serbs, and they wanted to throw off the domination of the Austrian Empire. So a nationalist group assassinated the heir to the Austrian throne who was on a state visit to Serbia. So then all the allies of both sides were drawn into a war that increasingly got out of control to be World War I. Some older history books say the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was actually the cause of the war. It's one little tiny cause, but it is one that dominoed into the war. So again, the main causes of World War I: militarism, alliances, industrialization, and nationalism. Of course, it was a big, complicated war, and there were other causes: empires, arms races, religion hijacked by nationalism and militarism, monarchy. The Franco-Prussian War was a particular European war where a lot of grudges. They were glad, both the French and that what we know as the German people now who lived in Prussia, they were glad to go. Some of them were glad to go to war to settle old grudges and other old rivalries throughout Europe. So these are things, if you're really interested in World War I, you could examine more in a project, but it's one small course. So, and of course, war reparations, which countries would fight, and after the war, one country would have to pay great penalties to the other country. This would cause resentment. The next generation would want their money or their territory back and go to war again. And this just led to a spiral of war in many parts of Europe. So, were these good reasons to fight a war and kill 22 million people? Let's look at some propaganda posters from World War I. So there's one, and that's what recruited men here and women here in the Sydney area. The Empire needs men. So whether it was Canada, Australia, India, New Zealand, answer the call, go defend the Empire. Why? No one ever said why, because it was the Empire. It was your duty, and God wanted you to, so you'd go off and kill the enemies of the Empire. So there's one recruitment poster. Here's a poster that was aimed at women. You've heard what the Germans have done in Belgium. Have you thought of what they would do if they invaded this country? So women were scared into nagging the men to go to war because the Germans were going to come and do war crimes here in Canada. It's true that Germans did some terrible war crimes in Belgium, but that was used as a reason, as a pretext to pull people into the war. Other countries ignored war crimes all the time unless it suited them. So again, the thin khaki line, the fate of Belgium, keep it from your hearth and home, enlist now. And then they would appeal to, you weren't a real man if you didn't go to war. It's men we want. Send more men. These are all appeals based on reason. So I maintain that World War I was fought for no just reason. And I use the word just because the next video is going to quickly introduce you to something called the just war theory. Let's quickly look at some multiple choice questions. So match the term with its definition. Empire. Here we go. Arms race. Propaganda. War reparations. And the dates of World War I in Canada. Which of these caused World War I? The main reasons. So look for your MAIN there. And indeed, all of those caused World War I. Which of these also contributed to World War I? So these are a few of the many secondary reasons. Arms race, empire, old rivalries, religion hijacked by militarism, and again, all of those things. Citizens are educated to believe that their country and their ethnic group were superior in military power and strategies. Refers to military power was superior? Militarism. And these were based on perceived national interest, family loyalties, traditional ethnic and religious rivalries, and greed. So what were based on those things? Alliances. And what is a feeling that a country